The air in the nursery wing smelled like burning wiring, and something else I could not name, something that did not belong inside a palace that had stood for 400 years. I heard it before I saw it, a low, deep pulse traveling through the walls, the kind of vibration that comes not from the palace systems, but from something outside them. I had been mopping the corridor near the third archway, when the lights shifted from their soft evening amber to a cold, flat white emergency lighting. And then, 3 seconds later, the lights went out entirely. I stood in the dark and counted to 5. Nothing good ever follows a sudden silence like that. I had learned that a long time ago, on a different world, in a city that smelled like rain and rust, where I was 7 years old, and I already understood that when everything goes quiet without warning, it means something is about to go very wrong. My name is Davinose. I am 26 years old. I am human, and for the last 3 years I have been a domestic servant in the royal palace of House Vile, in the center of the Vile Dominion, on a planet so far from Earth that the light from our sun would not reach this system for another 800 years. I did not choose to be here. None of us chose. When the Veil arrived above Earth 14 years ago, they did not come with war. They came with something more difficult to refuse than weapons. They came with technology, with medicine, with the promise of integration into an empire that spanned 11 star systems. The governments of Earth signed treaties within 18 months. I was 12 when the first Veil administrators landed in Accra. I was 23 when I was purchased as part of a domestic labor agreement and transported here. That is how they described it in the paperwork. A domestic labor agreement. There is a certain kind of language that powerful people use to make uncomfortable things sound like reasonable arrangements. I had learned to recognize it early. The palace of House Veil was not like anything I had ever imagined before I arrived. It was not a building in the way that human buildings are buildings. It was a structure grown from resonant mineral compounds over generations, shaped by Veil engineers who understood architecture not as the stacking of inert materials but as the management of living space. The corridors adjusted their width depending on who walked through them. The ceilings breathed a slow expansion and contraction that regulated air quality, and the floors recorded weight and gait and stored the data in the palace's central intelligence system. Everything was aware, everything was connected, and I, as a human servant, was not connected to any of it. The Veil are tall, nearly 3 meters on average, with long, angular limbs and faces that are difficult for humans to read, because their emotional expressions are almost entirely in the movement of their secondary ear fins, rather than in their mouths or eyes. They are pale in the way that deep-water creatures are pale, as though they evolved in a place where color was a luxury that evolution chose not to spend resources on. Their eyes are wide and gold and catch light in a way that makes them visible in almost total darkness. They are ancient, by human measure, and brilliant, and they had the stars before we had writing. They found us, assessed us, and categorized us in roughly the same way a human biologist might categorize an animal that turns out to be more interesting than expected, but still fundamentally beneath serious consideration. I had heard the phrase used about humans more times than I could count. Capable, but primitive. And that phrase, those 3 words, told me everything I needed to know about how my presence in this palace was understood. I was capable enough to mop floors, prepare food that conformed to Veil nutritional standards, monitor environmental systems in the nursery, and ensure that the Queen's 3 children were kept safe, comfortable, and occupied. I was primitive enough that no one thought to ask what else I might be capable of, and I had learned, in 3 years of invisible service, that invisibility is not always a disadvantage. Queen Ithera was the sovereign of House Veil, which meant she held political authority over 14 inhabited systems, commanded a fleet of over 2,000 warships, and was considered one of the 12 most powerful individuals in the known galaxy. She was also, in the private hours of the evening, a mother who sat at the edge of her youngest child's sleeping platform and told them stories in a low voice that she did not use anywhere else. I had heard those stories. Servants hear everything. It is one of the things that people who employ servants tend to forget. Her children were Sova, Rael, and Owen. Sova was the eldest, 9 years old in Veil terms, which put her developmental stage somewhere around a human 12-year-old. She was precise and skeptical, and had a habit of watching me with her gold eyes, in a way that suggested she was running calculations I was not aware of. Rael was 6. Loud, physical, fascinated by everything mechanical, and completely uninterested in the concept of personal boundaries. He had broken into my quarters 4 times, simply because he had learned that the access code was a numeric pattern, and he liked patterns. On was 3, and small even for a young Vale, and had not yet fully developed the secondary ear fins that older Vale used to express themselves. She communicated mostly through a high, clear sound somewhere between a chime and a whistle, and she had taken to reaching for my hand when we walked through the garden corridor, which was something none of the palace staff had mentioned in my orientation, and which had taken me several weeks to know how to respond to. I responded by holding on. The Queen had left 4 days ago. A diplomatic crisis in the outer systems. Something about border territory and the Kith. A splinter civilization that had broken from the Dominion 3 decades ago, and had been a persistent and sometimes violent problem ever since. The Royal Guard had reduced to a skeleton watch, because the primary force had gone with the Queen. The palace was quieter than usual. I had used the time to fix a coolant leak in the nursery ventilation, recalibrate the humidity controls, and memorize the locations of every maintenance panel in the eastern residential wing. I memorized things. It was a habit, and people who considered me primitive never thought to consider it a threat. When the lights went out, I put the mop against the wall, closed my eyes, and used the map I had built in my head over 3 years of walking these corridors every day. 20 steps to the nursery door. I counted them in the dark. I reached the door. I pressed my hand to the panel, and found it was cold and unresponsive. The power to this section was completely cut. I reached into the maintenance belt I wore around my waist, the one that the guard captain had once called a funny little human habit, and pulled out a manual override tool I had fashioned from a broken calibration device 6 months ago, because the nursery's mechanical backup system was designed for Vale hands and I had needed to create something I could actually operate. I pressed it into the manual slot. I turned it. The door opened. Inside the nursery, Sova was already awake, sitting straight on her platform, ear fins flat against her head, the Vale signal for serious, controlled alertness. Rael was standing on his platform, looking at the ceiling, listening. Owen was making the small chiming sound that meant she was frightened, but trying not to be. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me and said, in a voice as level as I could make it, "I need all 3 of you to come with me right now. Do not bring anything. Stay close." Sova looked at me for exactly 1 second. Then she climbed down from her platform and stood at my side. Rael jumped down from his with enough force to shake the floor. "Is it an attack?" he asked. "I do not know yet," I said, which was true. It might be, which is why we are moving. Made the frightened chime again. I crossed the room, picked her up, and held her against my side. She was heavier than a human child her size would have been. Vale bone density is roughly twice that of human bone. But I had been carrying maintenance equipment through these corridors for 3 years, and my arms had adjusted. "We are going somewhere safe," I told her. "I know exactly where we are going. Hold on to me." She pressed her small face against my shoulder and held on. I had 11 minutes before whoever had cut the power reached this wing. I did not know that as a fact. I knew it as a feeling, built from 3 years of watching how this palace moved, and how its security gaps worked, and how long it would take someone with a plan to cross from the east breach point to the nursery wing. 11 minutes was an estimate. I decided to move as though it was 10. The maintenance door behind the water wall was not on any official palace schematic. It had been sealed 20 years ago during a renovation and forgotten. I had found it 8 months ago when I was tracing a ventilation fault, and the scan returned an anomaly that should not have been there. I had opened it, confirmed it connected to the old servant tunnel network that ran beneath the residential wing, and told no one. I had also, without particularly intending to, memorized every junction. "Follow me," I said. And we went into the dark. The tunnel was narrow and low and smelled like mineral dust and old recycled air. I moved through it the way I had learned to move through cramped spaces, sideways at the shoulders, leading with my weight forward. One hand on the wall. Sova was behind me, close enough that I could hear her breathing. Rael was behind her, quiet for the first time since I had met him, which told me he understood what was happening, better than his age might suggest. Rael was in my arms, her face still pressed to my shoulder, her breathing fast and shallow but controlled. She had stopped making the chime sound, she had gone very still, and that stillness made my chest tighten, because frightened children should make noise, and the ones who go quiet are the ones who have understood that the danger is real. I counted junctions, left at 3, right at 5, left again at 7. The numbers were not painted on any wall. They existed only in my head, built from months of walking these tunnels with a maintenance light and a notebook I kept in my quarters, logging dimensions and distances and the locations of access points, the way a person maps a place they know they might one day need to find in the dark. The palace's official emergency protocol for a breach scenario assumed that the royal guard would respond within 60 seconds, seal the affected zone, and extract the royal children through the main corridor to the primary vault beneath the throne chamber. It was a well-designed protocol. It assumed functioning communications, available guard personnel, and a functioning power grid. It assumed, as most official protocols do, that the conditions at the moment of crisis would resemble the conditions under which the protocol had been designed. They rarely do. I did not know how many of the guard were down. I did not know if the communications were jammed or simply cut. I did not know if the primary vault had already been compromised. What I knew was that the main corridor was the most obvious route, and the most obvious route was exactly where I would not be taking the Queen's children. Behind us, somewhere in the palace above, I heard a deep concussive sound. Not an explosion exactly, more like a pressure event. The sound of something being forced through a sealed space. My estimation changed. I moved faster. "Davan," Sova said, quietly, from behind me. "I hear it," I said. "What do we do if they get into the tunnels?" It was a reasonable question. Sova was 9, and she was asking it in the same tone that a military strategist might use when presenting a contingency analysis. "We keep moving," I said. "They do not know these tunnels." "I do. Do you know all of them?" "Enough of them." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is not a complete answer." "No," I said. "It is not. Keep moving." She kept moving. Rael spoke from the back. "My feet are wet." "There is a condensation leak at junction 4, I said. "I have been meaning to fix it, and step over the center seam and stay to the right." "How do you know that?" he asked. "Because I fixed the one at junction 2 6 weeks ago, and junction 4 has the same pipe configuration." Rael made a low sound that was his version of being impressed. Under different circumstances, I might have smiled. We reached junction 5, and I stopped. I put Odin down, carefully, and pressed my ear to the tunnel wall. The palace structure conducted sound in ways that its designers had not fully accounted for. Another thing I had learned by living inside it quietly for 3 years. If I pressed my ear to the right section of the mineral wall and held my breath, I could sometimes hear what was happening in the corridor on the other side. I pressed and listened. Footsteps. Not Vale footsteps. Vale walked with a particular rhythm, a long stride with a slight drag at the heel that came from the way their hip joints articulated. These footsteps were shorter, heavier, with a deliberate placement that told me they were wearing armor and moving carefully through an unfamiliar space. Keth. I had seen Keth soldiers twice in my time in the palace. Once during a failed diplomatic visit 3 years ago, and once in classified footage that had been playing on an open terminal I walked past, and no one had thought to close because I was a servant, and therefore probably not paying attention. The Keth were shorter than the Vale, broader, with a dark copper coloring, and a combat doctrine built around rapid close-quarters force. They were considered extremely dangerous in confined spaces. We were in a confined space. I counted the footsteps. 2 distinct gates. They were in the main corridor, not the tunnels, not yet. But the corridor ran parallel to our tunnel from this junction onward, and there was an access point 40 meters ahead that connected the two. I needed to seal that access point before they found it. "Stop," I whispered. I turned to Sova. "Can you hold Ophian?" Sova reached out and took her youngest sibling without a word. "Rael," I said, "I need you to be completely quiet for the next 4 minutes. Do you understand what completely means?" "It means no sound at all." he said, at a volume that was almost appropriate. Correct, not even that volume. Nod if you understand. He nodded. I moved ahead in the dark, counting steps, until I reached the access panel. It was a maintenance hatch, a simple swing door on a mechanical latch, designed to allow workers to pass between the tunnel and the corridor. It had no lock. I had noted this 8 months ago, and filed it in the same part of my mind, where I filed things that might one day matter. I reached into my maintenance belt. I had a tube of mineral bonding compound, used for sealing microfractures in the palace wall material, available in any maintenance storeroom, considered by everyone who knew what it was to be a completely unremarkable tool. I applied it around the hatch frame in a bead, working quickly, pressing the seal into the gap with my thumb. The compound took 40 seconds to set to a basic adhesion. It would not hold against sustained force. It would hold against a door being tried from the other side by someone who expected it to open. I pressed myself flat against the tunnel wall and waited. The footsteps came closer. They stopped at the access point. I heard the latch tried. It held. A pause. Then the footsteps continued past. I breathed out slowly. I went back to the children. Offin was pressed against Sova's side, ear fins folded in, not making any sound at all. Rail had his hands pressed over his own mouth, which was more discipline than I had expected from him. Good, I said very quietly. All three of you. Good. We moved on. The deep vault was not on any palace schematic that I had access to. I had found it not through any official record, but through a conversation I had overheard 14 months ago, between two of the older maintenance workers, a Vale named Cell and a human named Felix, who had been in service here for 9 years. They had been discussing a pressure irregularity in the lower residential foundation, and Cell had said, almost in passing, that the irregularity was probably because the old emergency shelter was pulling on the same thermal exchange system. Felix had nodded, and they had moved on, and neither of them had noticed me pushing a cleaning unit past them in the corridor. I had found the shelter 2 weeks later. It was 40 meters below the residential wing, accessed through a junction that did not appear on the maintenance map I had been given when I arrived, which meant it predated the map, which meant it was old, possibly very old. The door was a manual seal of a type I did not recognize, but the mechanism was not complicated. Once I spent 40 minutes studying it, and I had brought it open and looked inside. It was a single chamber, roughly 8 meters by 6, with its own sealed air supply, a passive thermal regulation system that drew on the planet's geothermal layer, and 4 emergency nutrition units of a design so old their labeling was in a script I had never seen. It would not appear on any scan. It would not appear on any power grid. It would not appear on any communications network. It simply existed, in the deep dark beneath the palace, waiting. I had spent 3 visits cleaning it, checking the air supply, and confirming that the nutrition units still functioned. I had told no one. I had written nothing down. It had seemed like the kind of thing that was better to know quietly. I understood, moving through these tunnels with 3 children in the dark, that the quiet knowledge of one overlooked human servant was the only thing currently standing between the Queen's children and a crisis that had defeated every official protocol designed to prevent it. I did not feel proud of this. I felt the specific clarity that comes when there is only one path forward, and you are already on it. We reached the vault junction. I found the concealed door by touch, 3 meters of smooth wall, and then a seam, and then the specific indentation that served as the handle. I pressed it the way I had practiced, twice to the left and once firmly inward, and the door opened with a low sound like something exhaling. Cool, still air moved out from the darkness beyond. In, I said. Sova went first, carrying Ovin. Rail followed. I came last and pulled the door closed behind us. Inside, I activated the single emergency light I had placed here on my 3rd visit, a small human-made device, a simple chemical glow stick, the kind that needed no power source, and produced a soft green light for approximately 8 hours. I had brought it from my personal kit. It was cheap and low technology, and completely invisible to any scan of palace systems. The children looked at me in the green light. Ron reached out her small hand. I took it. "Are we safe?" Ral asked. His voice was not quite steady. He was doing his best to make it sound like it was. I looked at the sealed door. I looked at the children. I thought about the footsteps in the corridor, the cut power, the size of the breach that could disable a palace guard network in a matter of minutes. "Yes," I said. "We are safe here." It was not a complete answer, but it was the truest one I had. The green light was steady and calm. Outside, somewhere far above us, the palace was in crisis. Inside this small, forgotten chamber, 3 children were alive and unhurt, and I sat between them and the door, and I did not move. Sova settled herself against the wall, Ochin tucked against her side. Rael sat cross-legged on the floor and looked at his hands. The silence stretched, and inside it something shifted. The high tension of the escape settling into a different kind of waiting, quieter and heavier. Orson made a small sound, not the frightened chime, something softer. I recognized it. It was the sound she made in the garden corridor when she reached for my hand. "Your mother is coming back," I said. I said it simply, as a fact, the way I stated other facts. The condensation leak at Junction 4, the 40-second set time for mineral bonding compound, the footstep pattern of soldiers moving through an unfamiliar space. Sova looked at me. "How do you know?" I did not look away from the door. "Because she is the kind of person who comes back," I said. None of them argued with that. After a while, Rael lay down on the floor and closed his eyes, and Ophin's breathing slowed against Sova's side, and the green light held steady in the dark, and I waited. I had gotten very good at waiting. It was something humans did well. When we had to, we could hold a position, hold a breath, hold a plan, for a very long time. Longer, I suspected, than most species expected of us. That was not a thing I would have said out loud. I simply sat with it in the dark, and kept watch, and waited for the sound of the right person coming through the door. Sometime in the second hour, Rael woke up. He did not make any dramatic noise about it. He simply opened his eyes, looked at the ceiling of the vault, and then looked at me. I was sitting in the same position I had been in since we entered, cross-legged near the door, back straight, eyes on the seal. "You have not moved," he said. "No. Are you not tired?" "Yes," I said. "I am watching the door." He considered that. Then he sat up, mirroring my posture with the automatic imitation of a young creature who is trying to understand something by copying it. "I will watch with you," he said. I did not tell him he did not need to. I just said all right, and we sat together in the green light and watched the door. The Keth had been planning this for a long time. I understood that now. Turning the information over in the quiet, the power cut had been precise. Not a broad system failure, but a targeted removal of the specific grid sections that controlled palace communications and guard response. The timing had aligned with the Queen's absence and the reduced guard rotation. Someone had studied the palace's security schedule, which meant someone had access to information that should not have been available to an outside force. There was a source inside the palace, probably more than one. I filed that information and kept watching the door. What I could not know was whether that source had access to maintenance records, the unofficial maintenance records, the notes I kept in my quarters, the map in my head. Probably not. I was a human servant, who would think to look at my notes. That was the calculation that was keeping the children alive. Not firepower, not official protocols. The assumption of everyone who had designed this assault, that the human in the nursery wing was not a meaningful variable. I was aware, sitting in the dark, that this was both the thing that had saved us, and the thing that made me quietly, persistently furious on behalf of every human in this empire who had ever been dismissed the same way. I did not dwell on it. There would be time for that later, or there would not be time at all, but either way it was not useful right now. Sova woke about an hour after Rael. She woke fully, and immediately, the way she always did, as if sleep was simply a mode she toggled between, rather than something that happened to her gradually. She looked at Rael and me watching the door. She moved to sit on my other side. "Has anything happened?" she asked. "No." "Good." She was quiet for a while, Then she said, "Davin, how long have you known about this place?" 14 months. "And you never told anyone." "I told you now," I said. She thought about that. "That is technically accurate," she said, "but not what I meant." "I know," I said. "I did not tell anyone, because it seemed like something that was better known quietly. I was not sure why I felt that way. I understand it better now." She looked at me with those gold eyes that were so difficult for humans to read, and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "My mother does not realize what you are." I kept my eyes on the door. "What do you think I am?" "I am not sure yet," she said, "but I think it is something the palace should know." I did not answer that, but I did not disagree with it either. Oaken slept through all of it, curled against the wall in the soft green light, one small hand still faintly extended in the direction she had last heard my voice. Outside the vault, above us through meters of mineral stone and old ventilation shafts and forgotten corridors, the palace was being fought over by people who believed the most important pieces on the board were the ones they could see. I had spent 3 years being a piece no one looked at. And here, in a vault that did not exist on any map, behind a door no attacker had thought to find, the Queen's children were alive and unhurt. Because I had paid attention. Because I had fixed things quietly. Because I had memorized junctions and listened through walls and built tools that fit my hands, and kept notes that no one read, and found places that no one remembered. And because, when the lights went out and the only path was through the dark, I already knew exactly where I was going. The green light held. I held my position. I waited. Rail fell asleep again, his head eventually tilting sideways until it came to rest against my shoulder. He was heavy and warm, and smelled like the mineral soap used in the nursery. I did not move. Sova sat awake for a long time, watching the door with me, 2 different species in the quiet, and said nothing more. Which was, I had found over 3 years, the deepest form of trust. There are things you notice when you are in a confined space for a long time, with people you are responsible for. You notice the quality of their breathing. You notice when it changes. You notice the particular cadence of a child sleeping versus the precise stillness of one pretending to sleep. You notice the micro variations in temperature that signal a shift in the geothermal exchange below you. You notice the way sound travels through stone and what it tells you about the world above. I had been noticing all of it for 6 hours when the sound changed. It was not a loud sound, nothing dramatic. It was a difference in the resonance of the structure above us. A specific pattern of impacts moving through the mineral composite of the palace floors, traveling down through the foundation, arriving at the walls of our vault as a faint vibration that my fingers, pressed flat against the stone, could just detect. Footsteps, but not the same footsteps as before. The Keth soldiers moved with the deliberate, weight-forward placement of people in armor who were not entirely comfortable in an unfamiliar space. They pressed their feet down before committing to the step. It was a small thing, but consistent, and I had cataloged it within the first 2 minutes of hearing them in the corridor. What I felt now in the stone was different. Longer stride, faster pace, the weight distributed differently, with a confidence in the placement that told me whoever was walking above us was walking in a space they knew. And then, much closer, the sound shifted again, not above us but lateral, in the tunnel network itself. Sova's earfins lifted. She had felt it through the stone as well. She looked at me. I held up one hand. She went still. The sound in the tunnels was approaching the deep junction, the turn before the access point to the vault. It was moving quickly but not recklessly. It paused at junctions. It was not moving like someone searching. It was moving like someone navigating. And then, very faintly, I heard something that stopped every coherent thought in my head for a full 3 seconds. A voice. Low, controlled, issuing a single instruction to someone behind them, in the formal register of Vael command dialect. I had heard that voice read stories in the private hours of the evening. I had heard it across a diplomatic table on the security recordings no one had thought to close. I had heard it precisely once speak directly to me. On the day I arrived, when the Queen had inspected the new domestic staff and paused briefly at my position and said, in a register that was not quite dismissal and not quite curiosity, that humans were a strange choice for a nursery appointment, and that I was to ensure the children were not bored. I rose from my sitting position. "Stay here," I said to Sova. She stood up as well. "Stay here," I said again, and this time I put every gram of seriousness I had into it, because what came next needed me to be the only unpredictable variable. She sat down. I crossed to the vault door. I found the interior release, a simple lever, nothing complicated, and opened it 3 centimeters, keeping myself behind the edge, and listened. The footsteps stopped 12 meters away. Then a voice, that voice, said, "Manual seal on the access point." A pause, then a lower voice. From further back, "Bonding compound, my sovereign. Applied from the inside recently." Another pause. And then, "The vault." The footsteps resumed, directly toward me. I pushed the door fully open and stepped into the tunnel. The light from the tunnel ahead was a high-powered handheld beam, and it blinded me for a moment, and I raised one hand against it, and when my vision adjusted, I was looking at Queen Ithara, of House Vale, sovereign of 14 systems, standing in a tunnel that she should not have known existed, with 4 of her personal guard behind her, and a look on her face that I had never seen there before. It was not the controlled diplomatic expression. It was not the precise evaluation I had seen her apply to everything, from treaty language to maintenance reports. It was something that had come before those things, something that had come up from underneath all of the layers of sovereignty and authority and power, and it was, very simply, fear. Not of me, through me, to the door behind me, to what she did not yet know was behind it. I said, because it was true, and because it was the first thing I could form into words. They are safe. All 3. Sova has a small bruise on her left forearm, from the initial move through the tunnel. Owen was frightened but is sleeping. Rail is... Rail. The Queen looked at me. I had described her expressions to myself many times as difficult to read. What was on her face right now was not difficult to read at all. It was perfectly legible. It was every parent who has ever been told their child is alive after a moment when they could not know. She moved past me and through the door. I stepped aside. I pressed myself against the tunnel wall and let the guard follow her through. And I stood in the tunnel in the dark, my maintenance belt still around my waist, my hands at my sides, the mineral bonding compound still faintly staining my right thumb, and I listened to the sound of Sova's voice saying "Mother," and Rail's voice saying something too fast and excited to follow, and Oaken's chime, the particular pitch of it, the one that meant safe, the one I had not heard in 6 hours. I leaned my back against the tunnel wall and looked at the ceiling and breathed. One of the guard had stayed in the tunnel with me, a tall Vale in full command armor, the insignia of the Queen's personal unit on the shoulder plate. He looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. "The bonding compound seal," he said, "at the access junction." "Yes," I said. "That held 2 of their advanced scouts for approximately 4 minutes. They moved on rather than force it." "That was the intent," I said. "They had no reason to force a maintenance hatch that appeared to be simply sealed from long disuse. Nothing about this tunnel network suggests it leads anywhere important." He looked at me. "And you knew that?" "I calculated it was likely," I said. "I was not certain. I worked with what I had." He was quiet. Then he said, "You also neutralized 2 of their operatives in the tunnel junction near the eastern residential access." I looked at him. "We found them," he said, "when we were clearing the tunnels." I had not mentioned that. I had been hoping it would not come up immediately, because there was a complicated layer of explanation attached to it that I had not yet worked out how to deliver clearly. "Yes," I said. "With a maintenance torch and a pressurized coolant release." "Yes." "And a section of ventilation conduit, from what we could determine." "Yes." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You are the nursery servant." "I am," I said. He said nothing else, but something shifted in the way he was standing. A small adjustment, a minute realignment of posture. I recognized it because I had been watching Vale body language for 3 years. It was the adjustment a Vale soldier makes when they are recalibrating their assessment of something they had previously placed in a category. The Queen appeared in the vault doorway. Anne was in her arms. Sova stood beside her. Rael was attached to her other side, talking rapidly about the tunnel system, and the junction numbers, and the bonding compound, which he had apparently found fascinating. Ithara looked at me in the tunnel. I said nothing. There was nothing immediately necessary to say, and I had learned a long time ago that silence was often the more accurate response. She crossed the space between us, 3 long strides, and stopped in front of me. Owen, from her arms, made a small sound and reached outward with one hand, the same gesture, the same small hand, toward me. The Queen looked at her daughter, then she looked at me. Then she looked at the tunnel around us, the sealed hatch, the marks on the wall where I had braced for leverage, the faint trace of coolant residue on the floor 20 meters away. "Who else knew about this vault?" she asked. "No one," I said. "I found it through a maintenance conversation 14 months ago. I confirmed it was functional and secure. I told no one because the value of an unknown asset decreases when it becomes known." She absorbed that. "That is the reasoning of an intelligence operative," she said. "It is the reasoning of someone who has been underestimated for long enough to understand that unknown assets have value," I said. I was too tired to be anything other than direct. Something crossed her face. I could not name it precisely. It was not quite amusement, and not quite calculation. It was in the register of something being encountered that does not fit the existing taxonomy. "They breached the east gate," she said. "They disabled the guard network in under 4 minutes. They had inside information about our rotation. They have been planning this for at minimum 8 months." "I suspected the inside information," I said. "The timing and targeting were too precise for external intelligence alone." "You suspected?" "I am a domestic servant," I said. "It is not my place to investigate palace security." "And yet," she said. "And yet," I agreed. The guard captain behind her made a sound. The Queen's earfins moved in a way I did not have the vocabulary to interpret fully, but which seemed to involve something like restraint. "The Keth operatives that you encountered in the tunnel," she said. "2 trained soldiers." "Yes." "You are a domestic servant." "I am a human," I said. "It is not the same thing." The silence that followed that was a different quality of silence than any I had produced in 3 years of living in this palace. It was the silence of something being reconsidered from its foundation. Rael, from his position attached to his mother's side, said, "He knows all the tunnels. He knows the junction numbers. He fixed the condensation leak at junction 4. A pause. He is very practical." I looked at Rael. Rael looked at me with his gold eyes and his young, serious face. "Thank you," I said. "It is accurate," he said. The Queen shifted Oaken in her arms. Oaken was still reaching toward me. The Queen looked at this for a moment, her child reaching for the human servant in the tunnel. And then she did something I had not once, in 3 years, seen her do in the presence of anyone other than her children in private. She let it happen. She moved closer. Just a step, close enough that Owen could close the distance, and the small hand found my arm and held on, and the Queen watched this with an expression that I did not have a category for, but that I filed carefully in the part of my mind where I kept important information. "We are going to have a conversation," the Queen said. "When the palace is secured, and my children are in a safe room with the guard I trust." "Yes," I said. "It will not be a brief conversation." I did not expect it would be. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she turned, with her children, and began walking back through the tunnel toward the palace. The guard formed around her. I followed, and no one indicated that I should not, which was itself a shift from the ordinary arrangement of things. Sova fell back from the group and walked beside me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, low enough that only I could hear it, "I told you. My mother does not realize what you are. I think," I said, equally low, "that she is beginning to." Sova looked ahead at her mother's back. Then she looked at me. "What do you want from this?" she asked. from whatever happens next. It was, again, not the question of a 9-year-old. It was the question of someone who had been paying attention, who had been running calculations, who had filed the right information, and was now processing it. I thought about it honestly. I want to stop being an asset no one knows about, I said. I want to be an asset someone knows about, intentionally, and chooses to use. Sova was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That seems reasonable." And we walked on through the tunnel, in the light of the guards' handheld beams, toward whatever was going to happen next. The Queen's private chamber was not a room I had entered before. Servants did not enter the private chambers unless specifically called, and I had never been specifically called to this one. It was on the uppermost residential tier, behind 3 security doors, and it was smaller than I had imagined. Not a grand stateroom, but a working space, with a low platform for sitting, a wall of curved mineral that functioned as a display surface, and a single long window that looked out over the city below, currently dark except for the emergency lighting of the response units still moving through the streets. The children were in a secured room 2 corridors away, with 4 of the guard that the Queen had personally vetted. I had been brought here by the same guard captain who had stood with me in the tunnel, whose name, I had learned in the walk back through the palace, was Kalvarath, and who had said very little, but had watched me throughout, in a way that suggested a continuous and serious recalibration. Ithara stood at the window. I stood near the door. Kalvarath was behind me, which was either protocol or precaution, and I did not ask which. The Queen spoke without turning from the window. "I am going to offer you something," she said, "and I want you to listen to the full offer before you respond." "I will," I said. "Your indenture will be dissolved effective immediately. That is not a question. That is a fact that becomes true the moment I finish this sentence." She paused. "You will receive full freedom of movement within the Dominion. You will receive transport to Earth if you choose it. You will receive a sum of Veil currency that I will have my administrative staff calculate, based on 3 years of service, recategorized at skilled specialist rates rather than domestic rates, which will be significantly more than what was originally arranged." I listened. She turned from the window. "You will also, if you consent to it, receive designation as a protected ward of House Veil. This is a legal category that has not been applied to a human before. It means that no administrative body within the Dominion can reassign you, reclassify you, or arrange any form of labor contract for you without your explicit consent. You would be outside the integration framework." She looked at me directly. "This is not a small thing. The political complexity of applying this status to a human being will generate significant discussion." "I understand that," I said. "I am offering it because what you did tonight is not categorizable under any existing framework we have for human servants in this palace," she said. "And because my children are alive. And because ONN reached for your arm in the tunnel." The last reason sat differently from the others. I did not comment on it. "Those are the options as I currently understand them," she said. "Freedom, compensation, protected status, and transport home if desired. I want to know your response." I had been thinking about this since the tunnel, since Sova had asked me what I wanted, since I had watched the Queen's face in the green glow of a chemical light while she looked at her children sleeping against the wall of a forgotten shelter. "I would like a different option," I said. Kalvarath made a very small sound behind me. The Queen's ear fins moved. "Explain," she said. "Earth is occupied," I said. "It has been occupied for 11 years. Under agreements that were signed, because humans did not have the political standing to negotiate anything better. My people are classified as a candidate species, which is the Veil administrative category, for a civilization that is considered technologically and developmentally insufficient for full participation in Dominion governance. That classification shapes everything: the labor agreements, the resource allocations, the presence of administrators who report to the Dominion rather than to any human authority." I kept my voice level. I was not angry in this moment. I was clear. The reason the classification exists is because humans are assessed as primitive, capable but primitive. The reason that assessment exists is because the Veil who made it were evaluating human potential based on what they chose to look at. They looked at our technology gap. They did not look at what we do with the resources we have. They did not look at what we adapt. They did not look at what we notice when no one is paying attention to us. The Queen was watching me with the expression she used when she was doing serious analytical work. "Tonight," I said, "the most powerful palace in the Dominion was breached by a force that disabled your guard network, cut your communications, and had inside intelligence on your rotation schedule. The official emergency protocol failed because it assumed conditions that did not exist. Your children survived because a human domestic servant had spent 3 years quietly learning things that no one thought to secure, because no one considered the possibility that a domestic servant might do something with the information." I stopped. "I do not want transport to Earth," I said. "I do not want to go somewhere and live quietly on the compensation you are offering, which is generous, and which I genuinely appreciate. I want to stay here. Not as a servant, as something that does not currently have a name in your administrative system." "Describe this unnamed thing," the Queen said. "An advisor," I said. "A human perspective inside House Vale. Someone who sits in rooms where decisions are made and asks the questions that are not being asked, because everyone in the room shares the same assumptions. The Dominion keeps being surprised by humans. We keep doing things that fall outside the expected range. Someone should be positioned to explain why that happens and how to account for it. Not to make humans easier to manage, but because an empire that does not understand one of its constituent populations is an empire operating on incomplete information." The silence that followed was long. I had said it. It was out of the dark vault of 3 years of quiet thought, and into the air of the Queen's private chamber, and there was nothing to do now but stand with it. "You are asking," the Queen said carefully, "to be placed inside the political structure of House Vale, not as a subject or a ward, but as a functioning participant." "Yes," I said, "with appropriate oversight, appropriate limitations, and a title that I am prepared to help design, if your administrative framework does not have an existing one." Varath said, from behind me, in a tone that was not quite disbelief, and not quite admiration. "He has already thought about the title." "I have had several hours of very quiet thinking time," I said. The Queen looked at me, and then something happened that I had heard about but never witnessed directly. Queen Ithara of House Vale, sovereign of 14 systems, commander of a fleet that could rearrange the political geography of a star system, laughed. It was not a polished sound. It was a genuine one, short and clear and surprised. The laugh of someone who encountered something they genuinely did not anticipate in a moment, when they were already running low on the resources required to manage anticipated things. "You are a strange species," she said. It was not an insult. It was an observation, with something at the edge of it that might have been, in a vial, the early form of respect. "Yes," I said. "We really are." She looked at me for a long moment. Her ear fins moved through several positions I had catalogued over 3 years, but never been the subject of. Then she said, "I will need to speak with my council. This will generate the significant discussion I mentioned. There will be opposition." "I would expect that," I said. "It may take time." "I have time," I said. "I have been waiting for 3 years. I am good at waiting." She moved to the sitting platform and settled onto it. Varath shifted position behind me. The city lights moved slowly in the window behind her, the response units still threading through the dark streets below. "In the interim," she said, "you will remain in the palace, not as a domestic servant. Your status will be reclassified as an advisory consultant, under the Queen's direct designation, which is a category that does exist in our framework, and which does not require council approval." She paused. "It is not the full thing you are describing, but it is a beginning." "A beginning is sufficient," I said. She looked at me with those wide gold eyes that caught every available light in the room and held it. "The nursery staff will need to be restructured," she said. "There is an internal source. Varath is already investigating." "Yes," I said. "The timing and targeting were not achievable with external intelligence alone. Whoever provided the information had access to the guard rotation and the communication protocols, which narrows it considerably." The Queen's ear fins moved again. "You have already been running that analysis." "Since approximately the 2nd hour in the vault," I said. Kolvarath, behind me, said nothing, but I heard the sound of someone writing something down. "Go and rest," the Queen said. "You will be assigned new quarters today, not the servant level. Something appropriate for a consultant." She paused. "And Davin." I had been turning toward the door. I stopped. "My daughter reached for your arm," she said. "Own has not easily trusted anyone outside her immediate family since she was very young. She was injured during a diplomatic visit, and the experience affected her." I did not know this. The Queen's voice told me she was aware I did not know it, and that she was choosing to tell me anyway. "I am telling you this because I want you to understand that what you did tonight was not simply strategic. It was—" She paused, and the pause was the kind that suggests a word is being reached for, from a place not usually consulted in formal conversation. "It was the kind of thing that is difficult to categorize, and easy to undervalue, and which I do not intend to undervalue." I stood in the doorway. "I held on," I said. "That is all." She reached for me and I held on. The Queen looked at me. "Yes," she said, "that is all." I left the chamber and walked into the corridor, and Kolvarath walked beside me, not behind me, which was a different arrangement than any I had experienced in this palace. The corridor lights were on again. The power had been restored to the residential wing 2 hours ago. The walls were the familiar pale mineral composite, the ceiling at its standard height, the air circulating with the quiet breath of the palace's living systems. It looked the same as every morning I had walked this corridor to begin my duties. It was not the same at all. Sova had been right. In the tunnel. I was not sure what I was yet, but it was something the palace was going to need to find a category for. The Dominion had 11 star systems and 2,000 warships and political arrangements that spanned centuries, and it kept being surprised by humans. I was going to sit in the rooms where the decisions were made. I was going to ask the questions no one else was asking. I was going to be, for the first time in 3 years, a variable that the people in power could actually see. Not because I had fought my way there, not because I had demanded it, because I had fixed the condensation leak and sealed the maintenance hatch, and memorized the junctions and held on when a small hand reached for me in the dark. And the person who ran this empire had watched all of that and done the math. That was how it happened. Not in a moment of glory. In a sequence of small, quiet, carefully maintained competencies that no one had thought to look at. That was, I thought as I walked down the corridor in the restored light of a palace that had survived the night, a very human way for something important to begin. Kolvarath said, beside me, "The advisory consultant designation will be announced to the palace staff before the midday period." "I understand," I said. "There will be questions," he said. "The staff, the guard, the administrative officers." "There will be," I agreed. "What will you tell them?" I thought about it. I thought about 3 years of invisible service, and a map built entirely in my head, and a door that had not been on any schematic, and 3 children sleeping in a green light while the palace above them was in crisis. "I will tell them," I said, "that I am the nursery servant, and that if they would like to understand what that means, they should probably start paying closer attention." Kolvarath walked beside me and said nothing, but something in his bearing had shifted again. And this time, it stayed shifted. The palace moved around us, its corridors adjusting, its ceilings breathing, its floors recording our weight and our gait, and storing the data in its central system. And for the first time, the data it was storing about me was data that would be read. I was no longer invisible. I had chosen to stop being invisible, at the moment and in the manner of my own choosing, and I was walking through a palace that had not yet finished understanding what that meant. Neither, fully, had I. But I had time. I had always been good at time, and there was a great deal of work to do.